I'm Noma Roberts Kjar, and I was born in 1921 in the LDS hospital to Olive Beatty Wallenstein Roberts and William Fred Roberts. I was their first child, and we lived in Salt Lake City at that time.
My name is Joseph Ashton Kjar. I'm the oldest son of Joseph E. and F.E. Ashton Kjar.
The earliest memory I have, I guess I was about 3, and I was playing with the children in the neighborhood, and we were outside and they were building new homes, and I decided to take a board and use it as a slide. And I got up at the top, the first one, and slid down the board, but halfway down I became impaled on a nail. I couldn't move and screamed for my mother, who came and lifted me off and took me home. And I remember all of my little friends went across the street and picked wildflowers and brought me a little bouquet of wildflowers to make me feel better.
My early childhood, and again I get this more from people telling me about it than I do about my own recollection. I do remember I had earaches all the time, and Mother was my tender nurse. And in the middle of the night I'd get earache, and she'd put a hot cloth on my ear, or put hot consecrated oil in my ear. And it always felt so good when my ear would burst and the pain would be relieved. But I had that quite a bit, and I remember one time I had earache so bad that my left ear particularly, kept running for a couple of months. I never got it healed until it finally healed itself. As a result, I'm, of course, hard of hearing. But, they tell me I had measles and all these other things, but I don't remember that. Mother also said I had smallpox, but I think they misdiagnosed that one.
Oh, and I just remember my aunt and grandmother Roberts coming up the street one day asking me if I'd seen Jack Frost. And I hadn't, and I felt so bad. That was going on 5, and I think we moved to Star Valley, Wyoming when I was 5.
Mother was very loving and kind and gentle. My father was a Scandinavian by birth, by descendancy. And he was very kind and loving in his way, but he was more autocratic than my mother was.
Daddy went on his mission to Missouri, and Mother went on her mission to the eastern states. And come to find out, she has pictures of living in Joseph Smith's home in Palmyra that we later were back there in the Joseph Smith home. But she was on a mission there. But they were both, and so they were both, we had a very religious home.
And of course we had a large family. I was one of 8 children. I had 2 brothers and 5 sisters. And we had some very enjoyable times together. I had 3 older sisters, and I was the 4th one, but the oldest boy. And I was spoiled by my sisters because I was the only boy at that time. And they treated me royally. And we had some great times together.
Mother and Daddy wanted to go to the movies, and they didn't make too much money, and they decided that if they didn't have the money, but they could find the money in a little jar in the kitchen, where they had been keeping their money for their tithing. And it had snowed, and the snow was very, very deep. And on the way to the movie, Mother fell down and lost her glasses in the snow. They looked and looked and couldn't find her glasses. Finally, they decided she wasn't meant to spend the tithing money, and they went back home. And never again did they ever use their tithing money for anything.
I guess my earliest recollection of times together was when we would go on vacation in the summer, and we would go to Bear Lake. Most of the time that was our vacation spot. And my sisters were very kind and loving to me. I had just an older sister, Betty, but she was very much in ill health for most of her life. But we were closest of all my sisters. I guess we were closest.
Our home was a little two-bedroom home, an unfinished home in Afton, and we had no running water. We had to go outside to a pump to bring the water. The children always laugh at me when I talk about this. And of course, no bathroom. So we had to walk 50 feet down the street, down the backyard to what we call an outhouse, I guess. And no electricity, and our home was heated with a coal stove. And one day, and we always put our galoshes by the coal stove to be warm, and I guess I was about 7, and I put my galoshes there, and I was getting them ready to go to school. And I picked up the galoshes. Just as I went to put my foot in, a mouse jumped out. And ever since then, I have been terrified of mice, because I could just imagine what would have happened if I'd put my foot down in those galoshes before the mouse got out. And outside we had a root cellar, and it was always, you know, my job to run errands, go downstairs, bring something up from the root cellar. And I knew that there must be mice somewhere. So all the way down the steps and all the way up, I'd sing, "I'm the boss of Bunkersville. I can fight and I can kill," hoping that the mice would hear me and wouldn't come.
Well, my brother Ted and I, my next younger brother than myself, we were very close. Only 2 years separating us. We were very close. We slept together, and that was and had our own bedroom together down in the basement of our home. And Ted he was named Edward, but we called him Ted. But he and I were very close together. We rode horses together. We went to the swimming hole together and did most things together. Well, I remember my brother Ted one time ate too many grapes or fruit of some kind, and it caused a seizure with him. And I remember Ted being on the big kitchen table, prostrate there, and Mother nursing him and calling the doctor and getting him back to shape. And I remember he was very ill, and that stuck in my mind. And I guess that's what drew me close to Ted, is we went through some things like that together.
I just have one brother, Reed. He's 2 years younger than I. And Mother had another baby, I guess, when I was about 8. She came all the way down to Salt Lake to have the baby. But the baby was born with its cord wrapped around its neck and died in the birth process. The doctor wasn't there, which was sad. We all got the news.
My first school was Forest Elementary School down in Sugar House. And I just went 1 year there before we moved up to Parley's area. But I remember very well my first year there. One of my earliest recollections was how good milk and graham crackers tasted together. And we got that every day. And I remember that right to this very day. But it was only about 2 blocks from our home, and so I got to walk to school, and I was the only boy that attended Forest School. My other two brothers were too young to go to school until we moved up in Parley's ward.
But another very traumatic experience for us when I was about 6, my father got a mastoid infection in back of his ear, and it became so bad that the doctor up there said that he should come to Salt Lake to have it operated on. So in the middle of the winter, there's no way of getting out of Afton except by horse-drawn sleigh. So, and in those days they would put a stove in the sleigh, and they would try to keep with, you know, the canvas cover, try to keep you warm while you're traveling, and you're in a bed of straw. And we got in the sleigh in Afton and drove in the sleigh all the way to Montpelier, Idaho, where we got a train to Salt Lake City so that Father could have his mastoid operation. And we lived with Grandmother Roberts for about, 6 months while he recuperated. He'd have to go in, every so often to have it drained. And he is very lucky to be alive, and we are very grateful.
I remembered I got caught in a stream of water that ran by the front of our house. I got caught in it when I was about 3 years old and fell in and was carried downstream under a culvert. And I got stuck in the culvert, and finally I came out the other end and the people rescued me. But I remember that situation quite well, and the terror of being stuck in the middle of that culvert. We moved from Windsor Street, which was where I attended Forest School. We moved to Pawleys area when I was 6 years old in 1926. So I had very little experience down in that area.
In the first grade, I think that I just drove the teacher crazy because I always was talking about something, loved to be involved in everything. And the school was heated with wood. And so out in the back they had these huge stacks of wood, cords of wood you'd call it. And at recess time it was so fun. We'd go out and play hide and seek in these cords of wood around the school. And our big activity were the seesaws at recess time. And we'd each take a gasoline or something to say we were better than the others. And my grandfather owned a Conoco gas station, so we were always the Conoco girls, and to see if we could do teeter-totter faster than the other people. But it was interesting. It was the only school in town, and we all went there together.
That was always one of Dad's big avocations and vocations, was raising chickens. And none of us liked it because it was a dirty old job to clean chicken coops. And we had to do that every Saturday. And I guess I did that when I didn't have to do it until I was about 8 years old. But we did it every week. Well, I learned I didn't like chickens. Chickens are dumb, but Dad loved them. And he had one pet brown hen that got so old he would go out at night and manually lift her up on the roost so she could get up there, and then he'd take her down in the morning. But that was Dad's pet, but the rest of us didn't like him.
One time my grandfather had owned a mercantile store on the corner, and it was only one in Afton at the time. And I have pictures that said Roberts Mercantile on it. And out in back they had a huge ice house full of sawdust where they would cut ice from the rivers in the winter and store them there. Well, one summer Rita and I went down to play in this ice house, and he took my father's watch with him, and he lost it in the ice house, and we never found it in all of that sawdust. And that's something that we just kind of remember to this day.
When we first moved up there, Dad had 2 acres of ground. He bought 2 acres, and my Uncle Marv Ashton bought 2 acres adjoining each other. And Dad planted trees and planted crops even before we moved up to Porter's Ward. And so we would take big barrels of water on the side of the car and go up to Portage area and water the trees that way. But then we got shares of irrigation water, and we would irrigate down the ditches. And of course, you took your turn, and many times it was late at night or in the middle of the night, and we would have to direct the water in those ditches, and that was a miserable job. And I remember many times I would go to sleep on the edge of the ditch because it was so late, and it was something I never enjoyed doing.
My father never got angry at anything, and I guess on one lesson I learned when I was 5, I went down to Aunt Nellie's. She was really what you'd call an aunt on the other side of the family, Aunt Nellie Roberts, and she owned a drugstore. And Mother found I had taken some candy bars and some pink popcorn home with me that I hadn't paid for. And I'd eaten them and become quite ill. But she made me go back and apologize to Aunt Nellie and take some money and pay for the things that I had taken. And since then, I have never liked pink popcorn. My mother and father, Daddy was a barber, Mother was a beauty operator, and they had shops right next to each other up there called the Roberts Barber and Beauty Shop. And Daddy, when his busiest time was on Saturday night, when all the farmers would come to town and go to the dances and go to the shows. And so he'd work until maybe midnight on Saturday night, cutting hair.
I remember very little about being baptized. I just remember that we went into the basement of the tabernacle where the baptistry was at that time. And I remember that I had my nice white clothes and was baptized. I think I was baptized by my father, but I don't recall exactly, but I'm sure that would be it. And that was a big occasion, of course, for us at that time.
Up there was in the ward, and I think, when I think about it now, you know, there's the pulpit, and then back of the pulpit are the choir seats. Well, when it was time for the baptism, they just moved the choir seats and pulled the floor up like a trap door, and there was the baptismal font. And of course, they had no way of heating the water, and up there in Afton, Wyoming, the water is real cold. And I just remember that, and how wonderful I felt after, though, knowing that I was clean, that all my sins had been washed away.
You know, I remember that when we lived on Windsor Street, the north side of the house was very shady and cool, and one of my earliest delights was Mother would make us lemonade, and we'd go to the north side of the house and have our lemonade there. And Mother would, it was genuine lemonade, it was real lemons, not instant. But I remember very little about Windsor Street other than it was in almost a park-like area. We had trees to the east of us and a little canyon that ran to the north of us where some very good friends of ours lived. But my main recollection of Windsor Street is when we used to go on vacation. We'd pile in the car, and in those days we had the old running boards with the luggage on the side and open touring cars, no windows, just eyes and glass curtains, you know. But it was a joyful time.
Father, Grandpa Wallenstein, and Grandma Wallenstein. He was a very important cheese man, and they hired him to come out west to run the cheese factory. But in the meantime, afterwards, he bought a gas station, like the Conoco gas station, and ran it. And he was bald-headed, I think, ever since I can remember him. And Grandma Wallenstein, I remember being in their kitchen with the huge, everyone lived in their kitchen, tablecloth on it, with a windowsill full of geraniums all year long. And I remember Grandpa had a barn and a chicken coop and a pig pen, and they always had, on one side of the house was all the vegetable gardens. On the other side were all of the fruit gardens, strawberries and raspberries. And of course they didn't have a refrigerator. They kept all of their things cold in a little wooden box keep, I guess they called it, out in the ditch where the water would run and keep it cold. And we'd put everything there. And we only had Jell-O in the wintertime because you could only gel it when there was snow.
I remember Grandpa and Grandma Kjar. They always would spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day with us at our home. They would stay overnight. And Grandpa Kjar was a sturdy old Scandinavian, and he liked his Scandinavian food, and Mother always made the point to prepare a Scandinavian breakfast for Grandpa and for my dad on Christmas morning. It was a food with goat cheese and anchovies and ableskivas. It was especially geared for Grandpa. And Grandpa was very quiet, didn't say much, but he was a grand old gentleman of the old school.
Well, he died when I was 1, and I really don't remember him, but I remember Grandma Roberts. She was a very petite little French lady, and they always had for breakfast eggs in an egg cup. You know, you put the egg in and then eat it out of the shell. She always had beautiful linens and a huge fern on a china pedestal that held the fern. But she had become, I guess she had osteoporosis because as she grew older, her legs became a little bowed. She'd had 14 children, and I guess she was just worn out. But she was a sweetheart. And I remember as a child, when we'd go there, she'd always have cold pancakes, and she'd put sugar on them and roll them up, and we'd let us eat these cold pancakes.
I remember Grandma Ashton, and I remember having met Grandpa just about one time. He passed away when I was just 4 years old, and they lived up on Wall Street and up on Capitol Hill. And then after he passed away, Grandma Ashton went to live with Uncle Marv. I remember Grandma passed away, and I remember my Aunt Jane, my mother's younger sister, took me up to touch Grandma after she had passed away. She was in Uncle Marv's bedroom, master bedroom, before they took her to the funeral parlor. And she was not, we didn't get real close to Grandma. Not because she didn't want us to, but she was just the kind that you didn't get close to. Now, Grandpa Ashton, I remember he was very jovial, even though I was only 4 years old. I remember how great he was, and he had horses at that time. Didn't have cars. He had horses, and he had a black beautiful gelding that pulled his carriage. I think they called him Charlie, Black Charlie. And Grandpa Ashton was very, very outgoing and loving and kind, and as was Grandma, but you didn't get close to her very often.
A few weeks ago, I landed with the expectancy and the hope of being able to see Europe. It was the first time I had ever been abroad. And I wasn't in any hurry to get back. And I was informed that while it wasn't in order to come back home, that there'd be a battleship waiting for me next week.
Charles Lindbergh was such a big name at that time. We followed him all the way through, and when he landed in Paris or in France, that was perhaps the biggest news event of my young life at that time. And then he toured the country and toured the United States, and at that time we didn't even have radio. We just had what we could get through the newspapers, but and the movie tones, we get that. But he was a, first off, I was very caught up with flying, and to know that he flew by himself all across that great Atlantic, and when you see his plane and see how he did it, it's an amazing thing. And he became a hero to me, and to millions of other people. First president of church that I remember is Heber J. Grant, because when Dad became bishop, he developed a close relationship with President Grant. In fact, he one time invited him to come up and speak at our ward, and I went with Dad to pick President Grant up at his home and bring him up to our ward where he spoke. And so I got to know President Grant. President Grant always was giving away books, poetry books, and he'd give some to Mother. One time he came on Christmas Day and called on Mother and my Uncle Marv's family, and left a poem a book of poems by Edgar A. Guest. And and I remember how beautiful his handwriting was. And you all know that story about how he struggled to improve his penmanship. Yeah, I remember him. And then he was very kind. He was not jovially kind, but he was kind.
I just know we always went to church, and Mother was always working in usually the junior Sunday school, and they always did their home teaching, visiting teaching. That was the most important thing to them. And later in their lives, they always, even though when we moved to Salt Lake and they had a barber and beauty shop, they always took every Wednesday afternoon off, and that they would go to the temple. And we just knew on Wednesday, this was their temple day.
Marv was about 5 years older than I was, and he and I got very close together because he had a horse named Babe, and it was my privilege to ride with Marv when he worked at his father's Sugar House Lumber Company. I'd ride him back of Marv on Babe, ride him down as far as 17th East, then he'd get off and walk the rest of the way, and I'd ride Babe on back home. And we also rode Babe over to Highland Park Ward for the Friday night movies. I'd get to go with Marv on that. My main recollection with Marv was when we played marbles. Marv was a great marble player, and oddly enough, he had a missing thumb on his marble hand, but he played marbles, and I always wanted to get possession of a big, gray, beautiful flint marble he had, and I would occasionally win it. Then Marv would take me again and win it back. So we'd go back and forth on those marbles. But he was so very kind, and we many times would raise rabbits together and pigeons together, and keep them in hutches over at Marv's place. Dad had his chickens, and he didn't want to mix the two, so we raised our animals over there in Uncle Marv's place.
Mother and Daddy would never go in debt for anything. They always wanted, if you wanted to buy something, you had to have the money ahead of time. to pay for it. But every month I would ride on the streetcar to in town with Mother to go around and pay all of our bills at the telephone company, the light company, and these other places. And we usually would stop at Cress's on the way home. They had homemade peanut butter, and we'd buy that and take home with us. But they were very, very strict about paying their bills. I learned that you're much more happy if you don't go in debt. And of course the prophet keeps telling us that.
Well, the Gardners moved up to Parley's just shortly after we did. They had, Mr. Gardner ran a grocery store down on 9th East and 17th South. And they came up to Parley's ward shortly after we did, and Dad, of course, involved him as one of his counselors in the bishopric. And that's where I met Dan, and Dan was a year younger than I, and we formed a very close relationship there. His sister Carol was a dear friend of my baby sister Noma, and they got so close together. But Carol came down with heart condition and died when she was only about 12 years old. But Dan was a very close friend of mine, and we made an association with Byron Paulson. His father was a contractor, and Byron and Dan and I were always together. We would sleep at each other's homes and go out together. We didn't date, we just went out together, and went camping together. And Dan was very great in scout work, and he is to this day. But he would go camping with me up at Mill Creek Canyon, and we'd stay for a week at a time. And his father would bring up food for us in the middle of the week, and so we had a good time. Just barely 12, 13, 14, something like that.
When I was about 10 years old, I guess, my father decided that he was very gullible and you could sell him anything. And someone came in and said that they were selling homes in Midvale, Utah, and each home had a chicken coop. And you could come down here and live and have a chicken coop, and you'd just be real happy. So we packed up and we moved to Salt Lake, and we didn't have any place to stay, so we went to live with my Aunt Grace on 1564 Harrison Avenue. She was a single lady, I guess about 40, never been married. So she took us in while they were supposedly getting a house out in Midvale. Well, lo and behold, we found out that all went bankrupt, and no home in Midvale, thank goodness. So Daddy and Mother opened a beauty and barber shop on 15th East and started there. And I started in the Uinta school in the 4th grade, and because I had come from Wyoming, they grouped the children homogeneously. They had four 4th grades, and I was put in the 4th one, who were the children who were the slowest. And but the next year they promoted me to the 3rd, so I made a little improvement.
Oh well, in the neighborhood we played run sheepy run, hide and seek, and we'd throw the ball over the home and try to catch it. And we'd like to play on Uncle Marv's home because it was such a high roof. And we'd throw the ball over that and then come around and try to catch the people on the other side. And we played steal a flag, which was another thing. We'd have a flag on our home and then a flag on Uncle Marv's home. And we'd try to steal a flag and win that way. We played all the childhood games, you know. But they became great rituals in our lives, especially in the summertime. We would gather at one of our places and start the games, and we would have eight or nine people playing those games. Most of them from our 2 families, but we'd also have young people from the neighborhood. A family by the name of Pipers bought a lot between our place and Uncle Marv's place and built a home there. And so we had the Piper children playing with us, 3 of them, 2 boys, 2 girls and a boy. And they were part of our crowd too.
My friend Virginia lived next door, and she was an Episcopalian. Her mother and father played golf. They had a live-in maid, and it was a very different life from ours. And I remember how sad it was on Christmas Day. She would come over. Her parents would get up and they'd open a few gifts, and then they'd go back to bed because, of course, they'd been partying all night. And here's poor Virginia and her sister, Helen, all alone with nothing to do. So they'd come over to our house as we open gifts and do things. And Virginia involved me with the Girl Scouts, and we'd travel to the Episcopalian church down on First South, I think, in about 30 East. Beautiful place. And we would go there for our Girl Scout meetings. And I remember one Easter time, the Scout meeting we went to, and as we walked in, we got there a little early, we found a few eggs here and there. So that was neat. So we just went all around finding all these eggs and eating them. Come to find out, that was the activity for the Scout meeting, and we'd ruined the whole thing.
Dan helped me build a tree house in a big old box elder tree on the northwest corner of our property. And so we built a tree house that we could sleep in and stay in and so forth, and throw apples at cars as they passed down the street. But Dan wasn't very mischievous. He was more obedient. But he was a very, and is a very fine man.
This was during the Depression, and we ate fish, trout, and we ate duck, and what else and elk meat and deer meat, until I just thought, if I ever get to the place where I don't have to eat those, I'll never eat them again, and I haven't. I just remember that everyone seemed to be level. There were no rich or no really poor, but we all just made do with what we had. And of course in Wyoming, we ate and grew everything that we consumed almost. And I remember that we had margarine. This was even during the Second World War, that came in a white, it was white with a little capsule in the bar of margarine, and you'd break the capsule and then mold it so it would be yellow and look like butter. But no one could afford butter. Well, and then during the war, of course, butter was rationed because it went to the army, so we were all eating this margarine.
My cousin Phyllis, who was Marv's younger sister, was suffering from a heart condition at that time, and she spent almost 1 full year in bed with that condition. But when we went to Grand Canyon, the elevation was so high that she blacked out and passed out. They had to take her back to the cabin. But I remember it was a fantastic thing because we'd never been that far away from home. And Mother would fix food in the old car, and Mother had a big, today you'd call it almost a crock pot, but it was a big thing that you could also sit on in the car. And Mother would make a big batch of beans, and we eat that en route or when we got to our place. But going to Grand Canyon was a major trip for us. And it took us 3 days to get there. Traveled by car. Uncle Marv always had a much better car than ours, but Dad would had an old Dodge. At that time it was an open air Dodge with, as I said before, no windows in it. But I remember there were several hills that we had to negotiate that we'd have to stop and put water in the radiator because it would steam up and overheat, you know. But we had some great times together with the Ashton family.
This was on Harrison Avenue, Virginia. We had a large front porch, and we'd each take one. I'd take one side, she'd take the other, and we'd have all these dress-up clothes and jewelry and perfume bottles, and we were just so thrilled to be playing movie star. We even played movie star hopscotch, where you would make a big square on the sidewalk with about 12 or 14 squares, and if you got through, then you got to put some movie star's initial in the box, and if they could guess it, then they got to have their turn, and if they didn't, then you could have another turn. But movie stars seemed to play, a great deal of, well, they were your idols, really, and we had good ones in those days. Gary Grant, and Hepburn, and all of these people, and it wasn't R-rated anymore. They were good movies. I think Noma was at that time, was one of my favorite movie stars. And of course Clark Gable. Oh, he was so handsome. And the fabulous movie Gone with the Wind, when it came out. And when I lived in Afton, that's when they first started making talkie movies. Before then, they were all silent. And I remember how fabulous it was when I was 6 and I could go to a movie where there was talking. It was marvelous.
Well, many times we'd have family home evenings together, either their place or our place. I remember one time we had over at my Uncle Marv's place, and he invited a phrenologist, a man who studies heads, and he gave each one of us a head reading, which was very humorous, and he made it real entertaining and interesting, because he'd feel our bumps on our head and give us a reading on our life through a head reading. And so we had and then Uncle Marv had a pool table in his basement. That's where I learned pool. And Marv Ashton, my cousin, taught me pool, and it was always my goal to beat Marv at pool, but he was too good.
When I was in junior high school, we always had family home evening, but we'd have it on Tuesday. In those days, they hadn't said Monday was family home evening. Just have one. We always had ours on Tuesday, and we'd go to the Marlowe Theater on Tuesday night because they gave free dishes away, and that was the way we got our dishes, was by going to the movie. They were nice dishes.
Well, everybody says I look a lot like my father, and I'd like to say I took after my father, but I don't have any of the great qualities that he had. He was a man to be reckoned with, really, a great man. I was honest, like my father, but I guess physically I remember I resemble him more than either of my brothers. At least they always told me that.
Well, every summer, that's the only vacation we ever took. We'd go with Uncle Doc and Aunt Ressa up to Grays River. That's on the way to Jackson Hole, up in the mountains. And then we'd camp out for a week. And they'd take all the food, in the, what are those? Dutch ovens. And they'd plan it, and we just lived with the fish they would catch and so on. And I think the last time we went, I was in junior high school, and after we got home, a man came in Daddy's barbershop saying they had been there, but they said they couldn't stay in the same place because they'd become overrun with mice. And I thought, golly, I had laid out on the ground and wasn't even aware. So that's the last time I think I've ever slept on the ground.
Yeah, marble was my favorite game at that time. Of course, that was at that time for most young people. And I would stay after school and play marbles, and I was going to win the championship of all of Sugar House at one time, but I met a fellow by the name of Jay Blackburn who was better than I was, and he's the one that beat me in the finals. But I got close enough to be called a champion, but I never got good enough to beat Marv Ashton.
When I was about 9, Grandma Wallenstein came down from Wyoming. We were living on Harrison Avenue because she felt, the doctor told her she had gallbladder problems, so she came down to have a gallbladder operation. And after they got in, they found out she did have gallstones, but she also had colon cancer. So they just didn't complete it. They just sent Grandma home with an opening in her side. And she stayed with us, I guess, about 6 months to recuperate so she could go home. But each night I'd go in to Grandma and I'd say, "I'll see you in the morning," because I was afraid she'd die during the night. And so in the morning I'd jump up and she was still there. Good. So ever since then, for the last 60 years, I've always said to Joe, "See you in the morning." And it's a common phrase we use. But Grandma went back home, and she lived another year, long enough to take care of her own daughter, who was 28, who was dying of another disease that was incurable. So she took care of her daughter until she died, and then Grandmother died in Star Valley. And cute Grampy could do anything. He was a master of all trades, and he lived to be about 97 years old. And I think Grandmother died when she was barely in her 50s. But he would always go travel around, live with his children, and while he was there, he'd do all of the repair work and help them.
Well, the Latin Club was Miss Law was the head of the Latin activity, and she was a very good friend of Miss Ensign, who was the music head of Irving Jr. And I got very close to both of them. I was sort of what you call their pet. That helped fill my social life. But I was head of the Latin Club and got to take charge of meetings and so forth. And I liked Latin. It taught me a great deal. I wish it still taught Latin, that tied to with Ivy Ensign and the music part. I had a good, what I called a good social life at that time, but it wasn't normal, you know, boy girl. But I got to like Miss Law. She was not a member of the church, but she was tough, and when she asked a question, you had to answer her in Latin, you know, within reason. But she taught us Latin.
I remember in those days, I would ride with Aunt Ruth in her car, but before to start it, she had to get out and crank the car, and then you had a little handle up by the wheel that'd kind of choke it so it would start. But and the cars all had running boards, and whenever we travel any place, we'd put all our suitcases on the running boards and tie them on. Then you couldn't get out of the car, couldn't open the doors, so you were crawling out the windows, but the windows didn't have glass in. They had what we called isinglass, which we would call plastic today, that just kind of clipped on.
I remember I'd ride my bike back home. And I remember I could pump my bike up Sunnyside Avenue, which is a good stretch. And at that time we only had one gear. And I figured if I could get up that hill in one gear with my bike, I was doing pretty well, and I did. I managed to do it. And it was good exercise, of course. was about a 3-mile trip anyway. I was a patrol leader, but I never got very far in scouting. I had a good scoutmaster, Lamar Buseth, and he would push us along as best he could, but I never grabbed hold of it real well. So I got as far as second class and was working on my first class, just about got it, until I lost interest and left scouting. I never left it, but I didn't get to stay active in it, and never got anywhere near my eagle, as I wished I had done. But we'd go on trips with scouting, and at that time Dan was very active in scouting. He was an assistant scoutmaster, and so he dragged me along to be part of the scouting program in our ward. And I remember we did the camper all down Liberty Park, which was not one of my favorite things, but we did a camper all down there. Oh, I forget it. I guess I'd have been 13, 14 years old when we went down and camped overnight in Liberty Park, pitched our tents and everything, and took part in various handicrafts shops, you know, and so forth.
I think I told all our family secrets in school. And I have a daughter that did the same thing in first grade when I'd go to visit. The teacher would say, she never sits in her seat. And I thought, well, just like her mother.
Well, the Hindenburg was sort of like the Lindbergh flight across the Atlantic. The Hindenburg, of course, when it blew up, we at that time had lots of radio coverage and news coverage, and then of course had the film of it in our Movie-Tone News. But that was something to see the Hindenburg blow up, and of course we saw it and heard it on the radio. It's quite a story, and of course it is one of the major aviation tragedies in all time.
When I was in 12th grade, Mother and Daddy decided we needed to leave Aunt Grace's home and have a home of our own. So they found this cute little cottage up on 21st East, 2288 South, 21st East. And we prepared to move up there. But 2 weeks before we moved, I was riding my friend Tressa on the handlebars of my bicycle down on 15th East, and there are streetcar tracks down the street. And as we were riding down the hill, Tressa put her foot in the spokes of the bicycle, which stopped us instantly. I flew over her and lit right on my face on the asphalt road. When I had cut my lip, and my face was all just blood, that was all. So someone took me down to Mother's beauty shop. She just dropped everything and took me to the doctor. Well, he sewed up my lip and tried to clean this off. But 2 weeks later, we moved out to 21st East. A brand new neighborhood, no friends, and here's this awful looking girl that's going to start junior high school, doesn't know a soul. And as time went on, my lip got started to swell, and I got a big lump on it, and then these scabs here. No one would even talk to me or be my friend. I've never been so lonely in all of my life, and so I know what it's like to be alone. But after the scabs went away, and a year later they did plastic surgery and kind of fixed my lip here, little by little I got a few friends, and we became accepted, you might say.
Well, Noma came up to visit. She lived at that time on Harrison Avenue, down by where her folks ran a barber and beauty shop. And she and the family came up to visit our family and Uncle Mar's family. And I remember this was right after she had her bicycle accident where she'd skinned herself up and so forth. And at that time, she was known as Toby, not Noma. We called her Toby Roberts. And I remember she was very attractive and very friendly, but very tomboyish. She'd play football with us and all the athletic and play softball. She could hit a ball farther than most of the boys in the neighborhood. She was feminine still, but a tomboy. And so we all got to like her very much. And I had a special, it wasn't love at that time, I just felt that she was very special to me.
I loved junior high. I felt that I learned more in junior high than I did in any other grade. Maybe it's because I loved the subjects that were taught, science especially. Algebra and geometry, I couldn't get at all. And I was not very fluent in Latin because my boyfriend sat in back of me and it was embarrassing. But anyway, after junior high, and at recess in junior high, we'd always go out and play softball. And I loved to play baseball, and it wasn't a very nice thing for girls to do in those days. And so I always wished, well, maybe I should have been born a boy, because I loved to do those sorts of things. And so I kind of got the reputation of being a tomboy.
I know I was old enough to drive. I just turned 16, and Dad decided to take us three boys with him for his trip up there. And he took our tennis rackets with us to Portland and played tennis all the time that Dad was in meetings. And I remember that the elevation was so different that it was hard to tolerate. And I thought, well, they're much lower than Salt Lake, but we got winded very easily for some reason or other. Anyway, we played tennis and had a good time, and I got to drive, which was part of the way out, and it was a great thrill to me. And Dad had just gotten a new, not new, they were all his used cars, DeSoto four-door sedan, and we got to take that up there.
But this is where I met Joe. He lived just a block down the street from me in Parley's Ward, and all of the children in that area, we'd get together on Sunday nights and go over to the Burnsons usually and play games like coin or charades or something else. Or we'd go over to Uncle Marv Ashton's. He had a pool table in the basement, and we'd play pool. But we all played together, and then sometimes we would do bad things like throw tomatoes at cars that were passing after dark.
Oh yes, I enjoyed athletics. I enjoyed neighborhood football and neighborhood basketball. We had a backboard up on the south side of the ward lot there next to the chapel. We played that, and I never got into golf at that time, but yeah, we played athletics, and Noma would join us, and we'd play softball out in the big field just across from her home on 21st East.
We just got to know each other as friends, and later on, Joe and I would be together in ward plays, probably the leads, and my other two friends, Phyllis Ashton and Aline Midgley, the three of us were cast as a trio in one of our ward shows, and it became so successful that we just kept on, and this woman took us under her wing, who was a fabulous pianist, and she used to write our music for us and play for us, and we used to be asked to go sing at weddings, at meetings, and we were even on KSL in one of their amateur shows, and we came in second. We didn't come in first, but we loved to sing. This is while we were in high school.